Next, I want to talk about micro skin detail. Of course, we know about pore details. We spent hours and hours sculpting them, but there's actually another layer of even finer details in the skin that we can achieve through shading. But let's take a look at our photo reference to illustrate what I'm talking about. I need to find a good image. This one is good, but on kind of a zoomed out level. I wonder if I have any closer ones. Oh, let's try this eye here. Okay, I think we can see evidence in this example. Through the magic of editing, I'm going to highlight the pore level details we already sculpted, but then in between those details, there's another level of a crisscrossing noise-like pattern. Basically, you can think of it like a leather pattern scaled down really, really small. And we absolutely need this component if we're ever going to render close-ups of the eyes or the mouth, pretty much anything this close or closer. Because as it stands right now, our current version sort of breaks down the closer we get. Right, so if we focus on the cheek here, the details start to get muddy. We reach the limit of our sculpted detail. Same thing in the eye. It's a little bit better in the eye because there was more geometry there, but still we're not getting that really, really fine level of skin detail, which is also evidenced really well in this picture. All right, let's see if I can compare this to ours. All right, so ours is a little bit muddy, where this one is full of like little specks basically. And this is that micro skin detail working its magic. And so when we're zoomed out, it does serve as kind of a noise pattern where it especially almost makes the speck sparkle to a degree. I know that might sound like a weird description, but trust me, it's important. But as I said, especially for anything closer, it's going to play a critical role. And thankfully, it's not that hard to implement, though it will shake up the balance of specularity that we've achieved so far. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We're going to achieve the pattern procedurally with two Voronoi textures. So I'm going to jump down to the bottom of our node network and Shift A, let's add texture, Voronoi texture. And we will escape so we get our viewport rendering back. And let's Shift Control click on the Voronoi, Control T to add our trusty texture coordinate and mapping node. And we're going to use object coordinates. We're not going to use UVs because as a procedural texture, it's not necessary. And there's a slight risk of seeing the seams where the procedural doesn't match up perfectly. So it makes way more sense to just use object coordinates. And we want the scale to be much higher. Let's go 100. All right, so this is the basics of a Voronoi pattern. We've already seen this with the eye textures. But if I add a converter color ramp and we invert the flags or flip them, you'll start to see this kind of leather pattern take place. And if we add a vector bump map and then Shift Control click on that bump map, okay, by default, the color ramp went into the wrong socket. We want that on height. Okay, so now you can see what this is going to give us. The strength is way too high. We want to keep it low, like 0.1, and then maybe increase the scale a little bit more to like 200. All right, so we can get a feel for what this texture is going to do for us. And the only thing I don't like is how the inside of each cell kind of has a peak, right? Sort of like a mountain. I want to round that over the best I can. So in the color ramp, I should be able to do that with the B-spline interpolation. If I just use linear or really any of the others, we'll get a flat spot at the top pretty quickly. All right, so just that flat spot really ruins the organic feel of the texture. So we'll switch to B-spline and then drag that up. See if the B-spline will take care of that point. And admittedly, it is pretty difficult to round that over. But I've found that if I add another flag and just cross over, do you see what I did there? I added one more flag from the left side of the white and then just crossed over, and it rounds it over pretty well. Now I want to stretch the texture and rotate it sort of diagonally across the face. And if you're wondering, isn't this texture way too big? Yes, it is, but I just find that tuning the initial values is more helpful when it's larger. It will be much smaller than this eventually. So yeah, I wanted to rotate and scale this texture. If we go to 0.5, let's say in the scale, maybe 0.3 actually, let's elongate it a little bit more and then rotate it. I'm actually not able to rotate with one mapping node. So when you want to do multiple rotation and scales, you kind of need an order of operations. So if I remember correctly, I need to do rotation first. So we'll turn off scale or just take it back to default 111, and then rotate the Z value to 45, and then duplicate the mapping node, turn the rotation to 0, and then do the scale to 0.3 in X. Now you can see that it's scaling in the rotated direction, and it won't ever do that with just one mapping node. And then let's see, do I also want to rotate the Y value? I think I do. There we go. You can see it sort of angled from top to bottom across the face. That's what I want. And then I want to mix it with a duplicate of these nodes, rotated the opposite direction. So Shift Control D to duplicate these, Shift right click to drag a reroute node just to make it a little more readable. And then for our rotational values, I'll take the negative and make it positive. So 45 and negative 45. All right, so if we see what that looks like plugged into the bump, we should get the opposite. Yeah, okay, you see how it's stretched in the perpendicular orientation? And now we can mix these. Color, mix RGB. And we're going to do a 50-50 mix. And that is going to be the final texture, albeit much larger than it will be ultimately. But just so you can make sense of it at this larger scale. All right, now we can add an input value node so we can control both Voronoi scales with one value. So we're going to need to go much higher. Let's try 500. Move these nodes over. Plug this into both scale sockets. And to find the right size, you need to remember kind of the scale of our pore details. We could try stepping that up in the viewport level, but that's going to bog down the scene. So I've found that a value of like, I want to say 5,000 if I remember correctly. Although we're kind of losing some of the stretched feeling. Maybe not. What if I do try and stretch it a bit more, like 0.1, 0.1. Yeah, maybe that's too stretched in areas. I do remember 0.3 being the value I used in rehearsal, so I'm going to trust that. And again, we're not going to be this close for the renders. It's going to serve primarily as breaking up the specular reflections. So I know this is not perfectly anatomically correct, as if it were harvested from a photo, but it's definitely going to get the effect across. Okay, so yeah, we'll stick with the 5,000 value for the Voronoi scale, and let's plug this into our shader's normal socket. Oh, wait a minute, that's we have two shaders, so let's make some room. Let's move this over. There we go. And now this goes into the normal socket. And let's make sure we're on a good slot. View render 5. Yeah, that works. We'll go to 6, make sure we're using the same lighting. I think it was this one right here. And, pardon me, I think I rotated this 90 degrees. Okay, yeah, that should match. And let's see, I want to test this initially by rendering really big on just the eye right here. All right, so let's actually kind of reset our render slots. So I'll go to slot 1. And I will disconnect the bump and change our render resolution to 400. I want this to be really big, but it's just a small piece so that we can see what it does up close. And then I'll switch to slot 2 and plug in our new bump map. All right, let's compare at full resolution. Ooh, okay. Yeah, I like that. This is before and after. All right, so watch this area right here. Before, really washed out, low res feeling, and after. Immediately, much more detail, much more realistic. It holds up at this zoomed in high resolution. I get really excited about adding the micro detail. It's another big step forward towards believability, in my opinion. Now, it's not perfect. Something else I want you to notice, when we add this, it sort of blurs out the reflections, whereas before, the reflection in the cheek is a bit more clear, a little bit more vibrant. Afterwards, it kind of spreads out the reflection, and that's, how reflections work. If you look up a visualization for what lighting does on a diffuse surface, it's the surface that's really bumpy causing it to look the way it does, whereas when the surface is smooth, it reflects clear. And that's very much what we're doing to our surface, where it was smoother, now it's broken up. This is what I meant by it throws off the balance that we achieved in the last video, which is fine. Now that we know how to balance it out, we just need to adjust those values. Namely, taking the lower register of the roughness color ramp even lower so that the reflections are a bit more clear. I'm also tempted to increase the strength of our bump map, which might be overzealous, but I at least want to try it. So let's go to slot 3. And so the more we increase the bump map, the lower we need to take our reflections in order to balance those values with each other. So let's see, if we take our strength to 0.2 and then take the lower register of our roughness color ramp, we were at what, 0.3? Let's go to 0.2 and see what that does. Ooh, that's looking pretty good. Let's take a look, full res. Right, so this is the kind of noisy, sparkly quality I was talking about earlier. It really takes the skin to a new level. Although, it could be a little too strong. Let's see the before and after. Wow, okay, so in broad terms, it kind of, I don't know, flattens out the shape of the infraorbital rim right here. So before, you clearly see that shape in the reflections, and after, it kind of goes away completely. So, it may be the kind of thing where I need to vary the strength of the bump depending on the area of the face, rather than a global value. I do think that 0.1 works for most of the face, and for some reason the viewport is starting to slow down. But in certain areas, I do like the 0.2 value of the bump, especially up here in the eye, around the caruncle. I think that feels really nice, really realistic. And so that's kind of a glimpse into a really close-up shot. Now, how does this affect the look of the full face? So let's go to slot 4, which has a version of the full head. What was slot 5? I'm trying to find the last version we rendered before the various lighting conditions. Okay, so it was 5. So if I go to slot 6, this will be a good comparison with the bump. And so let's render it as it is. Let's go back to solid view and Control B to select a border render region around the head. And we'll render it with 0.2 strength in the bump, just to see if it really flattens out the geometry surface shapes the way it seemed to in that last render. And whoops, I forgot to change the resolution back down to 200%. That would have taken a while. Okay, so let's see the before. This is no bump and with bump. You see what I mean? How it sort of flattens out these features? Like really bad. Look at this cheek. Without the micro detail bump, the surface shape and topography is understandable, even tangible. And then once we add the bump, it flattens out significantly. So yeah, I'm definitely thinking that 0.2 is too strong in most areas. So let's try 0.1. We'll go on the other side of this pre-bump version, so meaning slot 4, so that we can easily switch between no bump and then both versions of the bump. And this one will be version 0.1 in strength. Okay, let's see the before and after. Before and after. Oh, that looks so good. I mean, we're going from somewhat muddy pore detail where it's very smooth in between pores to crisp, sharp details with a ton of variety. I think this is a huge upgrade. Let's go back to that spot on the face. Remember where it was particularly blurred out? I think because the cheek has probably some of the broadest geometry in the sculpture, so the details wouldn't be as sharp. But then with that extra micro detail on top, yeah, looks so much better. You can see the ear benefiting from that detail as well. The side of the nose here also. So yeah, I think 0.1 is the best value for the majority of skin. And certain spots I might want to bump up to 0.2. Remember, 0.2 was this. Look at the cheek. Just gets really, really noisy, too noisy in fact. So yeah, 0.1 is the right balance. And let's see, the last thing I want to try, oh, look at the lips. Oh, that looks so cool. Anyway, the last thing I want to try is incorporating the black and white value that we plugged into the bump node. All right, so the micro skin detail, I want to try applying that to our specular socket, because what I miss from when it was 0.2 and arguably too strong was that in the areas that it looked nice, it did have a lot more detail feeling. And so I want to capture some of that by plugging it into the specular value. All right, so let's go back here and we'll probably render in slot 3 as a comparison. And you know, since we've built these components, I want to squeeze as much use as I can. And so the value I'm talking about is this one right here, which we probably can't tell much. We need to go to rendered view. But yeah, our color ramps are so skewed towards one side that we can't really see an intuitive representation. But if I add another color ramp, this is going to be a little bit weird. I need to add some reroute nodes. Yeah, how am I going to fit this in here? Okay, so let's shift control click on the color ramp, and I need to bring the black flag way up. Yikes, like super far up. Like, let's go 0.99. Okay, now we're starting to see all that lovely bump detail. Really, really fine resolution, but I want to plug this into our spec and kind of multiply it over the current value. The idea being that all these little black spots will reflect nothing and the bright spots will continue reflecting, and I think that can just push the detail a little more. I don't know, when you get to this stage, you kind of crave that hyper detail, and it can be a problem. We can take it too far, but I at least want to try it. Since we have the data here, we might as well. And I'm going to add a color mix RGB into the color ramp of the specular, and we're going to make it a multiply, and then grab the newest color ramp information, shift control click on that. All right, you see what we're doing here? So at 1, it's probably a little bit too strong. Let's go to 0.5, or maybe we go with an overlay instead. All right, let's turn that on and off. All right, that's a little bit too strong, I'd say. Probably 0.3 instead of 0.5. And it's actually still really strong. I feel like it's washing out the stuff underneath it. You know, it just occurred to me. So if we look at this spec, you know, we inverted the color ramp and it makes our pores most intense in terms of specularity. I wonder if I should invert that. Sorry, this is a bit of a rabbit trail. So if I take this third utility texture, utility pores, right? So the pores are all very black. And if I multiply, sorry, it's becoming a little bit spaghetti in here. Wonder if I can clean this up. Okay, so if we look at this multiply, let's take it up to 1. All right, this is essentially darkening the pores back to where they should be. Well, what about an overlay? Yeah, maybe that'll work out better. All I'm really trying to do here is increase the contrast of the specular data intentionally, not just with the contrast node, but I'm trying to eliminate the pores specifically from the specular data, and then on top of that, adding our micro detail. See that on and off. Now I feel like that should be a little bit higher. Ooh, ooh, can you just feel the detail here? Oh man, I feel like this could be pretty great. Or it could be too exaggerated. Let's do a render. Okay, I am on slot 3, perfect. Okay, let's see before and after. Okay, so the overall value of reflection did go down. The specular value went down, meaning it feels less reflective. I think that's okay. I do kind of see the detail of the pores start popping a bit more from this to this. So I do think the detail level has increased slightly, which is what I was after. But I want to do one more, and this will be the last one, to compensate for kind of taking down the overall value. And what I'll do is make the higher value flag of the color ramp brighter. So we'll go to like 0.6, maybe 0.7. That's probably too much. Yeah, let's go to 0.6. Yeah, and hopefully that feels a little bit more balanced. Nudging up the specular amount just a little bit. Make sure I'm on the right render slot. Okay, we'll just overwrite slot 3. All right, one last comparison. This is before and this is after. Yeah, I think this version has kept the intensity of reflections, but just tightened the details. Here, it's the same level of brightness, but they're tighter. Like I can see the pores better. I can see those tiny little creases better, just by a little bit. And that's what I wanted to do, just tighten those details. I think that's the best phrase for it. Again, at this point in the process, you're kind of a detail junkie, and you want to squeeze as much detail as you possibly can, because you can always dial that back if you need, but if you're low on detail, you can't create that out of thin air. So I'm pretty happy with the way the specular is developing. The only component that's really missing is an ability to control the nose, for example. Often this is one of the shinier parts on the face, whereas now it's one of the more dull areas. I also might want to isolate and control the eye region specifically, the lips, around the ears. The helix, I want to tone down the specular. So basically a way to control certain zones of the face. And then once we have that control, we should be more or less finished with our specular reflections. But, I do want to finish with multiple lighting scenarios. I think that'll turn out well. One last look for this video. I like where this is going.